In 2013, we are acknowledging the 160th anniversary of the First Church of Christ in Victoria at Paran. We are also celebrating with Urban Neighbours of Hope. This mission order of CCVT has now been involved in its pioneering ministry and mission among the urban poor for 20 years. The theme of the 2013 summits is tension. Let's talk about tension. As a movement, we were pioneered in a time and a culture different to today. We seek to be true to the DNA given to us by God in 1853, and we continue to discover ways to live this out in the 21st century. This is a point of tension, even for those of us who came along a bit later. We best discover God's future in the creative tension between our present and past reality and His kingdom dream for the world. That's the place where the Holy Spirit works best. Whilst we know that if there's too much tension, stress may result, we also concede that if there's not enough tension, our purpose may not be achieved, and there is little to no growth and improvement. This is one tension in which we live. Given these various markers of time, this year we will be honouring our pioneers, past and present. We will also be praying for the pioneers God is releasing among us to take us into a new season as a movement. But first, let's go back. In the mid-1800s, Mr. H.G. Picton pioneered Churches of Christ in Victoria. He established the first church in a tent in 1853. He was also the first Victorian Conference president in 1866. Around this time, Robert Service pioneered the first Churches of Christ publication, the Melbourne Medley. In 1863, Mrs. J. A. Davies pioneered the first United Women's Meeting in Victoria. That was 150 years ago. A year later, in 1864, Henry S. Earle became the first American evangelist in Victorian Churches of Christ, and at the time visited more than 11 churches. During the 1870s and right up to the early 1900s, Mr. W. D. Little was a pioneer evangelist in country Victorian congregations, and from 1879 to 1883, Stephen Cheek was also a pioneering evangelist in 5 or more congregations across Victoria and Tasmania. In 1884, Nettie Thurgood established the First Sisters Auxiliary in 1884, as well as the Church Aid Society in 1885, and then the Victorian Sisters Conference in 1886. She was also the first woman to have a regular column in an Australian Churches of Christ journal. Nettie and her husband Charles also pioneered the introduction of Christian endeavour to Churches of Christ in the late 1800s. Around the 1880s and 90s, Joseph Pittman and his wife became benefactors and founders of the Armadale Rescue Home for Women. Also in the 1890s, E.W. Pittman was known as the singing evangelist due to his pioneering liturgy work around the Brighton area. Henry George Harwood was a pioneer of tent missions in Victoria, and Frank McLean pioneered mission among Melbourne's Chinese community in 1893, establishing the Chinese mission in Queensbury Street in Melbourne, of which William Hing became the first Chinese ministry assistant. Mary Thompson was a pioneering missionary, the first Australian Churches of Christ missionary, lay or ordained, male or female, to serve overseas. And Aaron Burr Maston established the Austral Printing and Publishing Company and the longest running journal of Churches of Christ in Australia, the Australian Christian. He also produced the most comprehensive history of the congregations of Churches of Christ in Australasia, the Jubilee Pictoral History. Will H. Clay was the Secretary and Superintendent of the Department of Social Service in Victoria. His initiatives led to the establishment of 3 aged care facilities, the Christian Guest Home, the Emmaus Rest Home, and the Murrumbina Nursing Home. In 1910, Charles Hardy and W.C. Craigie were founding members of the Church Extension Committee at Lygon Street. A couple of years later, Dr. William Alfred Kent pioneered the introduction of the Kappa Sigma Pi and the Phi Beta Pi clubs among the Churches of Christ young adults. In 1918, R.T. Pittman and Reg Ennis originated the first Sunday school material prepared by and for Churches of Christ. Thomas Bagley pioneered the Chapel Built in a Day events in Preston. He was a renowned leader of Victorian Home Missions, of which he was both Secretary and President, and was also Victorian Conference Secretary. In the mid-1920s, Eddie Atkinson became the first Southern Australian Aboriginal man to become a minister in a position at Australian Inland Mission, and then later a salaried minister in Churches of Christ around 1946. Around 1937, T.H. Scambler became the first chair of the Victorian Churches of Christ Committee for the Promotion of Christian Union, as well as serving as an army chaplain in World War I. In 1944, Alan Brooke became the first Churches of Christ Chaplain General of the Australian Defence Forces. Around the mid to late 40s, Edwin Lyle Williams made his name as our greatest theological thinker of the 20th century, and was principal of the College of the Bible from 1944 to 1973. Around the 1950s, Rita Roberts was a beloved leader of the Good Companion Girls Clubs for many decades. Pastor Sir Douglas Nicholls established the Gore Street Aborigines mission in Fitzroy and was a great leader of Aboriginal people. And in 1956, Lady Gladys Nicholls became the founder and matron of Indigenous Girls Hostel in Northcote and was a co-founder of the Women's Auxiliary of Victorian Aborigines Advancement League in 1957. She was also the founder and coordinator of Aboriginal Children's Christmas Giving Tree, a Sunday school teacher at Gore Street, and made it onto the Victorian Women's Honour Roll in 2008. In the 60s and 70s, Ken Clinton was busy being the first secretary of the Australian Churches of Christ Historical Society, which he then chaired for 22 years. He was also a lecturer at the College of the Bible and served on the Victorian and Federal Literature departments also for 22 years. In the early 90s, Phil Davis became the first female conference president for Victoria. Meryl Blair became the first woman lecturer at the Churches of Christ Theological College, which later became the Stirling Theological College, and Lynette Leach became the first woman CEO of the Conference of Churches of Christ in Victoria and Tasmania, as well as the first woman field director for mission and ministry. In the year 2000, Meryl Kitchen became the first woman principal of Stirling Theological College, a position which she held for almost 10 years.